Okay, we are recording now.
All right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Minnesota Alliance on Crime's January webinar, Building Identity Theft Advocacy Skills, presented by Suzanne Alwell of the Office of Justice Programs. My name is Julia Tyndall, and I am the program coordinator at the Minnesota Alliance on Crime. And I'll be working with our new initiative, the Minnesota Identity Theft and Cybercrime Information and Resource Network, otherwise known as MITCRN. Before we jump into Suzanne's presentation, I just want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about MITCRN, since that's what's allowing us to do this webinar today. MITCRN is a network that brings together community advocates, victim witness advocates, prosecutors, civil attorneys, law enforcement, government agencies, consumer protection specialists, and others across the state, with the goal of building capacity and expanding access to supportive services for victims of identity theft. I'm telling you all of this because I would love to invite you to participate in the work we're doing with this network. Participating will give you access to webinars like this one, as well as in-person trainings, a listserv dedicated to sharing relevant resources, and quarterly meetings where participants will work with committees to advance victims' access to supportive services. Quarterly meetings will also be an opportunity to share emerging research as well as get advanced training for serving victims. So there are a lot of great benefits to participating in the network. I would like to share with you two exciting upcoming events. First, we are going to have another webinar coming up a month from now on Thursday, February 1st, 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. We will be joined by Jay Hapala, the Associate Director of Community Engagement with AARP Minnesota. Jay will be talking about consumer protections and criminals tactics related to financial crimes, including scams, identity theft, and investment fraud. You will not want to miss it. We are hoping to have one more webinar take place in March, so stay tuned for more information on that. And then in April, we will be hosting our MITCRN Advanced Training and Network launch during National Crime Victims' Rights Week. The event will take place at the Wilder Center in St. Paul, Minnesota on Wednesday, April 11th from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. This will be the first opportunity for MITCRN participants from across the state to come together to network, so they can sign up for committees and receive advanced training on identity theft. So please do save the date and keep an eye out for registration on that as well. To sign up to participate in the Minnesota Identity Theft and Cybercrime Information and Resource Network, we ask that you complete a survey that will take about 5 minutes, where we'll gather your contact information and collect some data on the ways you and or your organization are already serving victims. We're going to send all of this information out after today's webinar, but I also want to let you know you can find out more about MITCRN on MAC's website, mnallianceoncrime.org, under the Identity Theft Network tab at the top of the page. So now I just have a couple of housekeeping notes for you before I introduce Suzanne. First, I want to let you know the webinar is going to be recorded and posted on our website for easy access. All participants have been muted for the webinar, but you can ask Suzanne questions by messaging me via the chat function. Suzanne will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. You will receive a short post-webinar evaluation via email, in an email which will also include the link to the MITCRN participation survey and the details on our upcoming events. Please take the time to complete this evaluation. It's really helpful for MAC to plan future webinars, and it helps us to report to our funders. The presentation for today's webinar is available for you to download in PDF form. You should see it on the control panel under handouts, and if you click there, you can download it and follow along as we go, or access it later. And finally, today's webinar has been approved for one standard CLE credit. The event code is 251449. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions. And so, without further ado, I would like to welcome Suzanne Elwell, Director of the Crime Victim Justice Unit at the Minnesota Department of Public Safety's Office of Justice Programs. Take it away, Suzanne.
All right, I'm getting myself set up. And Julia, let me know, am I showing up okay?
It looks like you are. We might be seeing the full screen right now on your computer with notes.
Julia, are you confirming that you can see me okay and hear me?
Yep, we can see you, we can hear you. We might be seeing your full screen with notes as well as your normal PowerPoint.
Okay, well, let's just deal with that then. How's that?
That looks great.
Thank you. All right. So good afternoon. This is Suzanne Elwell, and I'm doing a presentation I've done several times before because of my own experience dealing with victims who call the Crime Victim Justice Unit seeking help with when they become victims of identity theft. And they uh, would
Suzanne, we
say,
lost your
that my
audio
credit
for a
card was
second.
stolen and all problems and what to do to. Okay, I noticed that with you too, Julia, that you're coming in and out. So I haven't done anything differently. I haven't been moving. Do you think if I speak slower, I might do better?
I think it sounds okay to me right now.
Okay. So as I was mentioning, because of our own experience needing to understand how to help victims who contacted our office for assistance, one of my goals was to try to help others who might in their work encounter victims of identity theft and needing to know just some basic skills about how to help these victims, whether they're working in a domestic violence agency or working in a general crime program or a legal services organization, really to understand what things they can do to help that victim get to a better place. So the goals of my presentation is to understand this type of victimization, overcome that hesitancy and fear, and trust me, I had that fear when I first started trying to. I understand that we have some attorneys on the line, so just let me reinforce these are basic advocacy skills. There's a whole nother set of advanced advocacy skills that we rely on attorneys to apply. Some of you might have that, but I won't be going into that level of assistance. It's more for that immediate response is the focus of this presentation. Wanting to help folks just learn the lingo a little bit more about identity theft and inspire advocates to learn more about that. So the goal is not to have everybody become an expert on identity theft, but just to know how to respond to the immediate needs of a victim. When we talk about identity theft advocacy, I always think about it in two different buckets. We have those people who can work on preventing identity theft. For example, Jay Hopala from AARP does a lot of work in preventing identity theft, and there's a lot of prevention campaigns out there and a lot of information about how to prevent yourself from being victimized. We, as in our office, didn't have the resources to do that. We don't have the ability to do big prevention campaigns. But what we do have the ability to do is react when somebody says that they're a victim of identity theft and do that immediate assistance that that victim might need. And so our focus has always been on reacting to those victims who contact us and trying to help them with those immediate needs. But then there's a whole category of assistance and advocacy that's needed down the line to help repair that and help assist repair that harm that's been done to that victim, whether it's that emotional harm or whether it's financial harm or legal harm that's occurred. And that's more of a long-term process. And again, that's an area that I know something about, but I don't have the resources to assist victims in there. So as you're thinking about looking at this presentation, looking at what your organization could do, it could be that you focus on prevention, it could be that you focus on repair, or that you focus on reacting to the victim who contacts your office. Just so that we're understanding what what we're talking about, there's a couple definitions of identity theft. This is the FTC definition. Somebody uses your personal information without your permission to commit fraud or other crimes. The Minnesota statutory definition is very similar. Somebody uses or possesses your identity that's not their own, and with the intent to commit, aid, or abet unlawful activity. So basically, it's not just somebody is pretending to be you, it's that somebody's pretending to be you to do something bad, to get some benefit. So for today's presentation, we're looking at identity theft occurring when someone uses your personal information without your permission to receive some kind of benefit, usually through to commit a crime or through fraudulent means. So that's usually money or property, but it can also be medical care, education, housing, or for purposes of revenge. Just want to point out that when we talk about identity theft, oftentimes we're talking about a bundle of things that might be happening at the same time. That sometimes people are committing scams in order to get your personal information so that they can commit fraud. Or sometimes they're committing scams just to commit fraud. Or sometimes they're getting your identity through legitimate means to commit fraud. And so that oftentimes when we talk about identity theft, we are actually talking about maybe 3 different things happening at the same time. And identity theft is used as a shorthand method of talking about all sorts of bad things that might be happening in the context of stealing someone's identity. So there can be a whole hour presentation just on or actually a whole day presentation on the various types of ways that identity theft could take place. But here are basically the main ones. You've got credit card fraud, financial fraud, utilities and services. Somebody gets their gas account in somebody else's name, employment, using someone else's social security number to get a job, somebody renting an apartment under somebody else's name, or applying for public benefits, or applying for a tax return refund in someone else's name, or criminal identity theft, which is when somebody, an imposter, gets arrested or convicted under another person's name. So another victim now has a criminal record as a result. So who are victimized? Basically everyone. Juveniles might be victimized by their parents, foster children, by foster parents, vulnerable adults, elderly. Sometimes it happens after death. A person dies and fraudsters immediately go in and try to take advantage of those accounts that might be vulnerable. And then predeceased, which just means all of us. Anyone can be a victim of identity theft. And as you think about it, with all the new data breaches that have occurred in the last year or so, thinking Target and Equifax and Yahoo, where our personal information is out there, the chances of being victimized just go up. Who are the perpetrators? Again, a broad range of people. Could be family, your siblings, parents, foster parents, former or current intimate partners, your childhood friends, roommates, person committing other crimes like burglary, employees who have legitimate employees of companies or government agencies who have a legitimate purpose of having personal information, those employees stealing it in the course of their work, and then organized crime. And the bottom line comes down to that the people who are perpetrators are the ones that know you, that have access to your information through legitimate or illegitimate means, or that they steal or scam it from you. So somehow they have a connection to you to be able to get that information. Knowing who the perpetrators are makes a difference as you're helping a victim of identity theft, because it might make a difference in terms of the criminal justice response that you might get or the tools that you might have available to you. One of the reasons that I wanted to do this presentation and created this presentation several years ago is to recognize the harm that's done to victims. I think we all know about the financial loss that occurs when there might be identity theft, but we also need to think about that can have a ripple effect to these victims, that there might be damaged credit that then impacts their ability to get housing, A damaged credit could impact somebody's ability to get employment. If you have criminal identity theft, somebody has gotten arrested in your name, that it might impact your ability to get employment. So, for example, there was a woman who contacted our office because she had just recently found out that a childhood friend, somebody that she went to high school with, had been arrested under her name, that she had provided, she got convicted under that name. This was some years ago. And the victim who called us said she didn't know about it until years later, after that conviction, that this had occurred. And she found out about it because she had applied for a nursing job at a local hospital, and it came back, the background check came back saying that she had this conviction for a disqualifying crime. And so she talked with the hospital saying, I'm going to get this worked out. She contacted the BCA. She went through the process that's available, the questioned identity process that's available to establish that, nope, you're not the person who was convicted. But by the time she went through that process, that employment offer was no longer open, that the hospital didn't wait for that process to go to completion, and instead made the decision to not hire her based on the preliminary background check that had taken place. So that had a significant impact on her employment opportunities and her future employment opportunities. The other kind of harm it might have are legal problems. For example, I had a victim call a Minnesota resident who called to say that he had a problem in Florida, that somebody in Florida had used his name to get a electrical connection to the apartment. And so there was an electric bill in his name, utility bill in his name. The person who rented that apartment moved out and didn't pay the bill. So then the collection, that debt went to collections. The collection agency eventually filed in small claims court and contacted the victim here in Minnesota saying, you owe this debt, pay us, otherwise we're going to sue you. The person in Minnesota said, oh, that's not me, and ignored that correspondence. What ultimately happened is that it went to court, there was a default judgment, and now this Minnesota resident has a default judgment in Florida that he has to deal with. And it's impacting his credit because it's a default judgment. So this is a person who has some significant legal problems to contend with. It takes a lot of time to correct a credit problem sometimes. It's very tedious, it's detail-oriented, and it just takes a lot of time. So, for example, we had a speaker at one of our conferences who was a victim of identity theft by a person who actually had her same name but lived in a different state. And this person continually took out new credit, continually took advantage of the fact that this other person had her name, and just caused havoc on this victim's life. And just when this victim thought that everything was taken care of and that she cleaned it up and she contacted all the creditors and she got it cleaned up with her credit reporting agency, this imposter would do it again. And even though this imposter had actually been convicted of identity theft, she continued to perpetrate this crime, causing all this problems for this victim. That spanned years, like 7 years. By the time she was a speaker at our conference, she had been dealing with it for 7 years. And then also it takes time to prevent the harm that's occurring as well, preventing further harm that might occur. In addition to that financial impact and the time that we're talking about, there's also an emotional toll. There's fear, anxiety, embarrassment, a feeling of helplessness. And usually at this point in my presentation, I'll look out at my audience and I'd say, okay, anybody here been a victim of identity theft, including, a compromised credit card? And pretty much everybody is going to raise their hand. And there's this nervous laugh as everybody realizes we've all had some kind of experience. And I say, has anybody, most victimization tends to be around the credit card, compromised credit card accounts, but inevitably somebody in the room will come up with a story of some victimization of themselves or someone they know that has caused havoc in their life. So it is something that is pretty common. And as I was doing this presentation over the years, it seemed like more and more people would raise their hands with those horror stories. So there's a lot of emotional harm that gets done. This feeling of embarrassment, if it's somebody that you know. My aunt was victimized by somebody who lived in her house and was embarrassed that it happened. She's a vulnerable adult, didn't want to really admit that she had been victimized. So there's a lot of emotions depending on who the victimizer is. You might feel betrayed because it's a close friend or family member. There's often less sympathy for property crimes. We live in a hierarchy of crimes where person crimes tend to get more attention and resources than property crimes. And there's less sympathy, I think, for property crime victims, just in a general sense. There's oftentimes a lot of frustrations when victims report it to the police and then get frustrated when nothing's going to be done, that they find out that there really isn't much of a response. We'll talk about that a little bit in a bit. And then it's just aggravating, they having to go through this and untangle this mess. And for those victims who, like the example I told before with the presenter, who have the recurrent victimization, it just means this recurrent harm. The time and the emotional harm that takes place just keeps going. And that's why it's so important that we try to prevent further victimization. So you're working with your client, whether you're in a domestic violence agency or you're on a hotline with a general crime victim number, or you're in the crime victim justice unit or in legal services, and your client says to you, I think my boyfriend used my credit cards, or someone created a fake Facebook account, or there's a default judgment in Florida for debt that's not mine, or somebody stole my purse and used my credit card at the holiday station. You've been alerted that you've got an issue for this victim. What are you going to do besides panic? So in terms of our advocacy goals, we have 4. We want to stop the immediate harm, again, that react phase. We want to identify the extent of the harm, again, react. We want to start repairing the harm, that long-term repair process, and we want to prevent further harm from happening. We want to do that prevention piece. So let's talk first about stopping the immediate harm. So the first thing I do, if somebody gave me one of those lines about alerting me to that they're a victim, the first thing I want to know is, how did you find out something was wrong? I want to figure out what kind of harm is happening, and I also want to figure out how long it's been going on, so I know what kind of guidance to give. I'm going to say, how did you find out? What have you done? When did you find out? Who have you talked to so far? To just get an assessment about what have they done so far. It's very common for a victim to call our office, and they've done everything. All the steps I'm going to be talking about today, they're on it, and all they want to do is double check, have I done everything that I can do? Or they've done everything and they want some advice about how to work with the police, and they're really on top of it. And other people are just at the very first panic stage. I just got my purse stolen, and what do I do? And so you want to know where they are in this process, so they can make the best use of your time when you talk to them and guide them in the right direction. Because you're going to be talking about 4 basic response steps. Not necessarily in this order, it kind of depends on where we are and how long ago the victimization took place, but these are the basic 4 that any victim of identity theft would probably take. The first one, and probably the most urgent one usually, is closing any compromised account. As soon as you find out that somebody's used your credit card, the victim should be taking steps to close that account before anything else. Reporting to the police, that might be the first thing, it might be the last thing, depending on how recent that victimization is. Contacting the credit reporting agency and reporting to the Federal Trade Commission. And we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these in turn. So first, close the compromised account. Why do we want to do that? Because you want to act like a victim. Victims are behaving in a manner that shows, I'm not part of it, I'm not in cahoots, and I want to minimize my liability. There are different reporting rules for credit cards versus debit cards. Credit cards, you need to report within 60 days of when your credit card statement was sent. So if you get a credit card statement in the mail and you realize that there's something fraudulent on there, you have 60 days to contest that and minimize your liability to $50. In comparison, for your debit cards, you have only 2 days between the time of discovery to report, and to limit your liability to just $50. So for those of you using credit cards for online transactions, it's probably a less secure method of purchasing things, because you're open to more liability potentially with a debit card versus a credit card. But definitely you want to stop any further harm from happening and show that you're acting as a victim. Again, what do victims do? They report to the police. And not everybody reports crimes to the police. We recently had the Minnesota Crime Victimization Survey that came out, and it talked about what's the most common type of crime that occurs for most people in Minnesota. It's a financial related property crime. And what's the rate at which it gets reported to the police? Pretty low. And the reasons why they explain why the victims who answered the survey explain why they didn't report credit card fraud. And if somebody uses your account and goes off to Target and uses your credit card, it's true. If you report it and you're going to be able to contain the harm that happened, a lot of times people don't report those crimes to the police. But in those situations where you are going to have problems, where Target doesn't believe that you're actually a victim, or whatever online purchase you made, you contest it and they don't believe that it was actually fraudulent. If you have to prove that you're really a victim and that credit card was used fraudulently or these financial transactions were fraudulent, you need to report it to the police to show I'm a victim. I did what I was supposed to do. I'm explaining how the crime occurred. This is going to substantiate your position that I'm the victim of in this situation for this transaction. It's always helpful if you're talking to a victim to just give them a heads up about the likely law enforcement response. It might be that you're not going to get a very enthusiastic response. And it's good to give victims a reality check about what it means to report to the police. So on the one hand, it's important to report to the police because you might need it later on if you run into problems with this whole identity theft situation that you have. So it's important to report, but it's very likely that it won't be investigated. When we have cross-jurisdictional situations where the bad guy lives in another state or in another country, and the local police department doesn't have the ability to really investigate, it could be that it's a very complex investigation that exceeds the resources of that particular police department. It could be that we just have law enforcement personnel that don't have the expertise in investigating that kind of crime. It could be that they are prioritizing, again, a resource issue, prioritizing person crimes over the property crimes. It could be that the amount of loss is fairly small and that they're not going to really look at cases unless we start talking about big bucks. Keeping in mind that for a person who without a lot of resources, getting victimized out of $100 could mean the difference between eating and not eating. So for them, it's a major crime in terms of the scheme of things for what police departments, law enforcement agencies are willing to investigate. It could be that they're only going to take those major crimes. The FBI will only take those major crimes where we're talking about $500,000 worth of victimization, loss for victims or more, and that before they'll start looking at those cases. And also keep in mind that the victim's relationship to the perpetrator might impact the law enforcement response. That if you say, hey, my boyfriend is the one that did this, my husband is the one that did this, you're not divorced yet, that might mean that they're not going to look into it. It's your child or a roommate. They might not look at it as carefully, saying, how do we know for sure that you guys aren't cahoots? How do we know for sure that, this time you gave her permission to use your card, but this other time you didn't? It gets more complex. And so that relationship might impact the willingness of law enforcement to investigate. And we see that with investigating crimes against vulnerable adults and elderly, about that relationship having an impact. Okay. So what's our third response step? Call credit reporting agencies, CRAs, to make a fraud alert. And a fraud alert just says to anybody who makes an inquiry to the CRA and there's a fraud alert, it just says you need to take additional steps to ensure the identity of the person seeking credit. It doesn't stop the awarding of credit. It just puts an alert saying there might be something up. Take additional steps. We have 3 credit reporting agencies in the United States: Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. And you can, let's go back. When you make a fraud alert, you can make it to 1, but it's supposed to be, if you make it to Equifax, they're supposed to share that with Experience and TransUnion. If it were me and I was a victim of identity theft, I would probably call all 3, and that's the advice I've heard from others, saying just to be sure, don't rely on Equifax sharing it. Just go ahead and make a fraud alert to all 3. And our 4th response step is to report to the Federal Trade Commission. And thankfully, way back when I first started doing identity theft advocacy, maybe 10 years ago, the reporting mechanism, there was one on the FTC website, but it was pretty challenging to use. I, in fact, tried to use it myself when I was victimized and gave up. But we are in a different world now with much more user-friendly technology, and the new identitytheft.gov website is wonderful for both finding out about steps to take in response to identity theft, as well as reporting an identity theft crime. So I encourage you any victim to go to that. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to be investigated by the FTC, but the FTC collects information through this portal for all states and collects information and is sharing that information with law enforcement agencies at the federal and local level and collecting information. So it could be that that victim who reports that they were victimized by a person who purports to be John Smith using this kind of business. It could be 20 people are doing that same thing and reporting this John Smith with a fake business is the one that stole their identity. And having that information in one spot available to law enforcement is the goal. So it's still helpful to report to police for investigation reasons, but also because that victim, again, acting like a victim, does what victims does, reports to the FTC, and has the ability to generate a report from that FTC reporting process. They can print it off, they can update it and print it off again. They can attach it to a police report. So when they do the FTC report, they just print it off, go down to their local police department and attach it to the report. And now they have it all the relevant information in one place. It's also going to be helpful when attempting to clear up credit problems that they might need that FTC identity theft report in that process.
Suzanne, this is Danielle. Can I interrupt with a question?
All right, so we talked about kind of look at identifying the extent of the harm. So another step is in this process is to advise the victim to get a copy of the credit report as quickly as possible and examine it carefully. The reason we're doing this is to find out, has anything been going on that we don't know about? This person just discovered the identity theft. Are there other compromised accounts, fake accounts that are showing up on their credit report? And looking at that, making sure there's nothing unusual or hinky that's showing up in the credit report. You might want to advise the victim, depending on what's been going on, to look at their bank statements and credit card statements carefully. I know a lot of people, including me, don't always look very carefully at every single credit card statement, but it is important to make sure that there's nothing unusual on there, something that doesn't belong there. Just ask them, have they noticed anything else, getting any other suspicious activity? Have they gotten any weird calls that make them think that maybe there's some debt collection issues going on? And also think about who might be behind the theft or fraud or suspicious activity. Maybe they don't know, and oftentimes when I ask that question, who do you think is behind this activity, they'll say, I don't know, and they don't. But if they do know, if you think it's your roommate or you think it's your ex-husband, then we might be talking about what kind of steps they might need to do to protect themselves from further victimization and do some safety planning. And then looking at that the goal of starting to repair the harm. One of the things I always want to reinforce in this presentation is the fact that this isn't just a financial loss, and harm that is taking place, that there's emotional trauma that takes place. I was a victim of attempted credit card fraud, and it took place when somebody called me up from a company in Montana saying, are you the one that's purchasing this equipment? And I said, no, it's not me. That wasn't me. And shortly after, I got another call from a different company saying, are you the one that's purchasing these materials to be sent to Nevada? And I said, no, that's not me. And so these two companies had their red flags rule, which all companies are supposed to have some kind of screening and red flags so that they can detect a credit card owner in Minnesota for a purchase in Montana and Wisconsin for delivery in Nevada. That's a red flag, right? So they contact me, we stop the purchases, nothing bad happened. They were attempting to purchase were equipment to manufacture credit cards. So for me, I didn't suffer any financial harm. I can tell you I freaked out a little bit. I had a lot of fear, and I thought, because I know how bad it can be. And just think if I was actually victimized, I know what kind of trauma that can be. But so I acknowledge that and understand that just like victimization of other types, that victims of identity have that same type of emotional response to being victimized. Loss of trust, fear of what might happen, as well as the emotional trauma because of the financial loss, not being able to get a job, not being able to buy the car to be able to work, things like that. It's important to be realistic about the investigation and prosecution and recovery. It is good to say that cases do get investigated. Most people calling my office are complaining that my case isn't going to be investigated, but we do know that county attorney's offices are charging identity theft and prosecuting those crimes, and it's good to see those cases come through. And occasionally we'll get a victim who calls and talks about a success story, but oftentimes they do not get charged if we do not know who the perpetrators are. Explain that now that you know that there are problems and that might be inaccuracies in some credit card or financial institution records or billing or credit report, there are tools that are out there that are designed to help those victims. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. And then also address those special considerations like I mentioned before. When the victim knows the offender, for example, when it's domestic abuse or elder abuse, it could be that you might be engaging in some financial safety planning with a domestic violence victim, or just regular safety planning that if this gets reported, is this victim safe if the crime gets reported to the police.
Suzanne, this is Danielle. Can I interrupt with a couple questions from our participants? Suzanne?
Sure.
Okay, good. First question is, what has been yours or other advocates' experience with financial institutions pushing back or not replacing fraudulently accessed funds?
I think I've heard horror stories, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit in terms of when is it time to call a lawyer? Because you do get that pushback. Victims do encounter problems with trying to correct inaccuracies on credit reports and billing and all those things. And there are tools that are out there to fix that, but there is pushback from those financial institutions and businesses.
That's great. The second and final question is, if you get an alert from a credit card regarding unauthorized use of the card and immediately cancel the card, should you still report to the police and credit agencies?
That's going to be up to you. I think most people probably tend not to. I think if you are worried that it's going to continue or that it's not an isolated incident, and that you're going to have problems with your credit card company. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. Again, start repairing the harm is that you have the ability to steer victims in the right direction. I've already talked about, we might be steering them to attorneys. There are many, many, many online resources, federal agencies, national organizations out there with plenty of information on the internet to help victims and guide them in a very easy step-by-step way. We do not have to recreate the wheel for that. We have on the OJP website, we have a webpage directed to identity theft that has links to both those national resources and state resources. And the other thing you can help victims do is to make sure that they are keeping organized. And it's really easy to lose track of things that go on. You get that one call, something bad goes on, you think you've taken care of it, you set that documentation aside, and then all of a sudden there's more things that pop up. If there's a identity theft situation, be sure you keep track of all the correspondence, keep track of anybody that you've talked to, the time, the date, the caller's name, and if they don't give you their name, the operator ID, everything that you can to keep track of those communications that you do to try to fix an identity theft issue should be maintained, because you might need that down the road if you run into those problems with financial institutions and credit reporting agencies. On the OJP website, Identity Theft Toolkit, that has actually a tracking log that you can use. You can provide to your victims that they can keep track of their correspondence and their communications with the various people that they need to related to the identity theft. And then again, like I mentioned, know when to refer to legal resources when there might be a civil lawsuit or a collection action. Debt collection agencies are starting to call or filing actions in small claims court when there's impact on housing foreclosure, or criminal convictions can get very messy. And keeping in mind that criminal convictions or criminal identity theft can be hard to try to repair for some victims, because oftentimes these victims might have legitimate convictions and convictions that are the result of an imposter, and trying to sort that out can be complicated. And then our goal is to stop future harm, to prevent that re-victimization. And so what you can do as an advocate is to advise the victim to take steps to prevent further victimization. Most common thing to say is monitor, monitor, monitor. You are going to look at that credit reporting credit report as often as you can. Under the federal law, everybody gets one free credit report per year from each credit reporting agency. That means all of us are eligible for 3 free credit reports per year. And you can suggest placing a credit freeze with each credit reporting agency. So we talked about the fraud alert and the credit freeze. A fraud alert is just one call, supposedly, to the credit reporting agency, and they will share it with the other 2, or if you want, call all 3. It's an initial 90 days, but renewable, and you can get a 7-year fraud alert, but for that you need an identity theft report. So again, one of the reasons why you want to file an FTC identity theft report. The military is able to get this when they're deployed, and all it means is that creditors must take, quote, reasonable steps to verify the identity. Now compare that with a credit freeze. That's where you have to write to each credit reporting agency. When you have a freeze, nobody can apply for credit, including yourself. Your credit is frozen to everybody, so that if you want to get credit, you have to thaw your credit. You have to go through a process of unfreezing your credit, so that if you're going to buy a car, you're going to buy a house, you have to unthaw your credit. So this is not something, if you're planning to buy a house in the next 6 months, you might not want to freeze your credit. It is more effective because no credit can be given if there's a credit freeze, and that for Minnesota victims, it's free if you are a victim of identity theft. Otherwise, it's $5 if you're not a non-victim. So for those folks who, for example, Equifax, data breach, there were some people that you could go and put your name in there and find out, yep, you were breached, and other people you put your name in there and you find out, nope, you weren't breached. So only those people who were breached would be considered victims and not have to pay the $5, although there was some concessions by Equifax about that as that became clear. With an extended fraud alert, you can also get yourself taken off pre-screened offers for 5 years, and you can get 2 additional free credit reports per credit reporting agency per year. So that you can up the amount of monitoring that you can do by checking your credit report. Just keep in mind for both of these, it's not going to stop any ongoing fraud, any accounts that exist already, and it won't stop the types of fraud where they're not checking your credit report. So you go to a car sale, used car place that says no credit, no problem, and they don't check your credit report, that won't prevent that victimization from happening. If you do want to get a credit freeze, we have a link on the OJP website to a request form that was prepared by the office or by the Attorney General's office. Okay, so in Minnesota, there are a number of statutes that deal with identity theft that are helpful to victims. One is that when a victim reports a identity theft, they only have to report it to one law enforcement agency, even if the victimization happened in a variety of places. So the person took her credit cards and then used it in 3 other cities. So ideally, she just had to make a report in one city, and it would have applied to all those cities. Law enforcement agency can aggregate those cases and investigate all those cases that occur in different jurisdictions. The problem with that is that some law enforcement agencies are a little bit more interested in investigating identity theft crimes than others. So my example, my victim who reported it in one metro city, she was very disappointed with the place where she resided. She was very disappointed with the response by the law enforcement agency, thinking they really had a ho-hum attitude and they didn't take it very seriously. And she could tell quickly where her card was being used by the time she was able to get and cancel her credit card. So she knew that it occurred in these other 3 jurisdictions. So she went ahead and she made a report in each one of those 3 jurisdictions. And one of those jurisdictions, in Brook Grove Heights, thank you, the investigator got interested in that case. And what he did is he went to the target where one of the cards had been used and got the film of the person making the purchase with her credit card, and then he put it on the little system that's law enforcement agencies are connected to that say, be on the alert for this guy. Somebody else in another jurisdiction recognized this guy and was able to ID him, and as a result of that, they were able to catch him and then charge him with the identity theft and theft of her purse. So it was because of the persistence of that victim that we had a better response. And so sometimes that might be something we would suggest to the victim to do, even though you are only supposed to have to report it in one jurisdiction. We have another nice benefit under the statute, which is mandatory restitution to victims, which means that if there's a conviction under the identity theft statute, that automatically the victim will be awarded less than a actual loss by the victim, that it's a flat out restitution order. And coincidentally, yesterday, the Minnesota Supreme Court issued an opinion in, Supreme Court. State v. Emil Ray, R-E-Y, and the number is A160198. That just came out, in which the defendant had contested the mandatory restitution order because there had been 66 or so victims and contested it on constitutional grounds. And the Supreme Court ordered that the imposition of the mandatory minimum restitution following the conviction of identity theft did not result in a procedural or substantive due process violation. So that makes it clear that that restitution statute stands. The other helpful thing under the identity theft statute is the fact that a victim can get free copies of court documents. So that means if there's this conviction of the offender, the victim doesn't have to pay for those certified copies of the complaint, for the judgment or of conviction, just one less thing that they have to pay for. So that is a benefit to the victim. So as they're trying to establish that they're victims of identity theft, they can get those court documents for free. Again, under the Minnesota tools, we have the Minnesota security freeze law. We have the ability under our driver and vehicle services to be able to put a red flag on your driver's license. So if somebody has posed as you or gotten a driver's license in your name in the past, or somehow got a fraudulent license with your name on it, that you can put a flag on your driver's license. That's the plus side. The downside is that if you are stopped for a traffic offense, it's going to show up as a red flag, and so you yourself have to establish that you're really the true person. But it's causing an alert to the law enforcement officer who might be stopping that person that there's a question about this identity. Under our statutes, that if there is erroneous information on background check, criminal background check records from a background check service, they have to correct those. So those victims of criminal identity theft have an avenue to try to correct erroneous information. And as I referenced before, there's this BCA question identity process for victims of criminal identity theft. And the process is that if you a person discovers that there is a record under their name, either an arrest record or actually, pardon me, a conviction under their name, what they can do is go to the BCA, provide their fingerprints saying, I'm not that person. The BCA compares the conviction fingerprints with your fingerprints, determines, nope, you're not the one who committed this crime, and they'll give you this document that certifies, nope, this person is not the one who committed this crime. So it's a sheet that doesn't look necessarily all that official, but it has a phone number where people can, like a business or somebody who is provided it, can call and verify, right, this person did not commit this crime. Unfortunately, it's for those people who have contacted us, and we've had a lot of victims of it, it doesn't look very official, and it's not a very satisfactory response for those victims, because it still doesn't eliminate the fact that your name is associated in the BCA database as being associated with that conviction. And when you do a search for under your name, if you have an imposter and a victim name, and the victim puts their name in, you put in that victim name in there, what displays in the BCA criminal search is the victim's name along with the imposter's name, with no distinction that it's an alias. So it's a bit problematic still. Hopefully with a new database for offender information, that problem is going to get relieved. All right. There's some federal tools. And I used to go into much more detail if I was doing a legal, for our legal services presentation, I went much more into the legal tools that are available, but they are under our federal law. We have Fair Credit Reporting Act, Fair and Accurate Credit Transactions Act, Fair Debt Collections Practices Act, and Fair Credit Billing Act. Not that we have to memorize all that, but what is important to know is what these tools gives the victim ability to do is get information about the fraudulent transactions. So the debt collector cannot be secret about what debt they think that you owe. If they have documents related to the debt, or the original creditor has those documents, you should be able to get those documents so that you can say, is there documentation to establish that they actually owe money? There are tools to correct errors, and there are tools to protect that victim from further harm. And that there are civil remedies, that if the credit reporting agency or the financial institution or the business doesn't comply with these federal laws about getting information or correcting information, there are civil remedies for the victim. And of course, once we say civil remedies, we're talking, of course, needing the assistance of attorneys to help with that. All right, so I just want to end talking about what your office can do, challenges to being an advocate, but also what things you can do. Keeping in mind that we have victims who might not have access to a computer, or they have insufficient computer literacy skills to access that FTC website. They might be non-native speakers, non-native victims. They come from vulnerable populations that just don't have the ability to navigate the systems that are there. It's complicated, and it's technical, and it's confusing, and it's overwhelming. And we've talked to plenty of victims who it's so overwhelming that sometimes people almost give up because they can't even seem to make a dent. And And the basic fact that all our advocates who might be encountering these victims are going to be more familiar with other areas of the law and systems, the criminal law, the family law, as opposed to these financial laws that might be out there. It could be that this problem has been going on for a long time. That includes many fraudulent accounts and many problems, so it gets very, very complicated. That there's multiple people who are victimizing him because that person's identity has been sold to others, and many people are using that identity, not just one bad guy, but many bad guys. Like I said, it may need the victim to take advantage of the legal remedies available, and again, it's overwhelming, really overwhelming. So what can you do knowing that it's overwhelming? Focus in on what it is you can do and your organization can do. It could be that you can work on prevention, or could be that you're on that immediate response, or you're in that long-term repair, but figure out, where do you fall in this scheme? Where can you help victims prevent being victimized or responding to be victimized? Maybe it is you can help that victim stop the bleeding and that's all you can do, or maybe it is that you're in that long-term repair. But identify what that is and then enhance those skills. And what can your office do? Well, at a minimum, you can teach everyone the 4 basic skills, 4 basic steps. Reporting to the police, calling the credit reporting agency. All of a sudden forgot. And do those 4 basic steps. Designate somebody to become the expert on responding to identity theft. Maybe not everybody has to know, but somebody becomes the ID theft guru in your office that can answer those questions. Incorporate prevention into your advocacy efforts with your clients. We've had domestic violence organizations have been doing financial safety planning for years. That's basically what we're talking about in this context. You can have your staff go through the OVC online training. It's free. I went through it, and one of the things I liked about it, in addition to talking about the tools that might be available to repair and all that, it really emphasized that what we're doing is applying our advocacy skills that we know in other contexts like domestic violence and sexual assault. We're applying it to this financial crime context and really understanding how we can meet the needs of those victims. And so I really encourage advocates to go through the OVC online training and stretch those advocacy muscles beyond our comfort zone. There's the link there about how you can get there. Also get this great resource, Taking Action. It was developed by the National Center for Victims of Crime and FINRA, the sorry, I can't get the acronym off the top of my head, but it is a great basic advocacy tool for to address victims of identity theft for advocates. And then there's a legal resource. It can be used by some for self-help if you have victims who can manage and think that can navigate the system, but it really is a legal resource for attorneys about the legal tools available to help those victims respond and repair to identity theft. And encourage you to, again, this is on the FTC website, is to get that guide and share it with your legal staff. Learn about your state resources. Like I said, we have an identity theft webpage on the OJP website, and it has just your basic advice, links to state and local and federal resources. It has our identity theft toolkit. We also have information on criminal identity theft if you've encountered that, your victims, but a lot of Minnesota-specific information. If that Minnesota tax return has been compromised, get that link to the Department of Revenue, for example. And also look to Law Help Minnesota. There are some great letter templates available on their website that are, those letters that you can do to contest a record in the credit reporting, some kind of entry in the credit report, or to contest information on billing and other banking financial institutions. So it has those templates already ready to go and to be filled in. And with that, I have a minute left for questions. Any questions?
Suzanne, this is Danielle. No follow-up questions that I can see.
Well, you have my contact information, so certainly if there are follow-up questions that you have, feel free to call me directly.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Suzanne. On behalf of MAC and all of our member programs, I want to thank Suzanne for taking the time to share her expertise with our members and allies and MidCurrent participants. Thank you to all of our participants for joining us for today's webinar. The webinar is going to be made available on the MAC website. It will be posted on the Resources for Service Providers page under the Identity Theft Network navigation button at the top of the site. Please feel free to share it widely so we can spread this foundational information. Please also take the time to complete the post-webinar survey that you are going to receive via email in a few days. This is important for our training, planning, and reporting to our funders, so please don't forget. And remember, we'll also be including links to the MITKERN participation sign-up and to our upcoming events in this email. Thank you all and have a great day.